Hey there, gang. This is likely to be a short and sweet one this week. I was looking around for something to film. I have some very big, very interesting jobs on the go, which are pretty involved, and you'll see those soon, but they weren't going to be ready for this week's video. So we're going to do a setup and some fret dressing on a Gibson ES335. This one is from 2004. Along the way, we can talk about what goes into a setup, what do you get for your money, what are you paying for. I occasionally take part in discussions with other like-minded repair people of varying levels of experience, and that's something that comes up again and again. It's a standard question. What do you charge for a setup? What do you do? I hear that guy gets $100. In some ways, this is sort of bread and butter work. It's one of the smallest normal units of repair, if you could call it that. This could be a standalone job, or it could be factored into a larger repair. Almost everything I work on gets a setup at some point. I don't do all that many standalone setups these days, and there are a couple of reasons for that. Primarily, a lot of people are seeking me out for the bigger jobs, and the waiting list is just too long. It doesn't make sense. It gets more and more difficult to suggest to someone that they wait upwards of 3 months for a simple setup. That's not to say it's beneath me or anything. Not at all. No. There are people who specialize in this. I'm thinking of, like, Evan Gluck in New York City. He somehow manages to get through, like, 1,200 individual repair jobs a year. So a lot of his income comes from these 1-hour blocks of time. And there's something to be said for constructing your schedule around that, because most of the time it's predictable work. There are surprises in a setup, but even those aren't that surprising after a while. I mentioned 1 hour, and that seems to be the consensus. A setup is a 1-hour job. That can vary a little. Some of them will go longer, and some guitars just are easy. They cooperate very nicely. Wait a minute, I hear you saying. 1 hour? How come you guys charge that much? Well, if you want to get pedantic about it, we could chalk it up to expertise, like a plumber, mechanic, a tax preparer. People got to get paid. And that 1 hour usually has a pretty big asterisk beside it. What do people charge for a setup in your area? I charge $80 Canadian. Right now that's about $62 American. To get back to that asterisk, there's communication time that has to be built into all of this. There'll be at least 3 or 4 emails or phone calls or DMs or whatever you use to establish a connection to talk about what's necessary for the guitar, the scheduling and that sort of thing. And that can add up to maybe 15 minutes worth of talking or typing. For me, it's typing. A lot of repair people who work alone, for them the phone is a non-starter at this point in history. It's different in a music store where you might have assistants who can answer the phones and take messages and that sort of thing. But so much of what goes on here involves a surprising amount of concentration and just, like, flow is the best word for it. If I'm into something, I'm not going to stop to answer the phone during the day. So, then there's also the period where someone drops off. There's usually 5 or 10 minutes worth of chatting there, in which we go back and confirm what needs doing and work out what's expected then. And it's the same again for the pickup. In the olden times, before lockdowns and distancing, usually we were, sitting down and someone was plugging in for a while to hear how the work went, check and make sure everything's okay. So for a 1-hour job, there's usually an extra 30 or 40 minutes worth of interaction that's off the clock, and that needs to be accounted for somehow. Often, but not always, there's a set of strings in that cost. Then there's the tax as well. I have to collect tax. I'm a business, I got to remit it. So figuring in those and the extra time, I'm really making about $40. And that doesn't include the overhead, the electricity, the insurance, cost of the abrasives and lubricants that I use and that kind of thing. So in some ways it's akin to why a restaurant charges you $30 for a steak, It's all the little things that go alongside it. It's not just the cost of the meat. You've seen other people on YouTube do a setup, probably. The sequence of operations is usually pretty similar. between everyone, because in order to be efficient at this, one step very much depends on the preceding ones. You take one measurement and that reveals a piece of the puzzle, and then you carry it on forward. You know, I always start with the action. First things first. In this case, I've got 5/64 on the bass, 5/64 on the treble. Different people measure in different places on the fingerboard. I do it at the 12th fret. It doesn't matter, as long as you're consistent. It's the same thing with measuring units. I don't care what you use. It could be millimeters, fractional inches, decimal inches, some system from ancient Babylon. It really doesn't matter. What's more important is that you understand how you're changing the action, and you know, some people even just do it by intuition. It's fine. If it works, it works. Setting the action height, though, you know, it's pretty fundamental, so it's usually the first thing we measure. Up next, I want to measure the relief in the neck, or the amount of up bow it takes while it's under tension from the strings. So I slap on a capo at the 1st fret, grab my stack of feeler gauges, tip it up into the playing position, and I'll hold down the bass or low E string against the frets, usually somewhere around the body joint. In this case it's 16th, 17th fret area. And I measure relief at the 6th fret. That's the underside of the bass E string and the top surface of the fret. Some people use the 7th fret, other people like the 5th. For me, it's always the 6th. And I like to see around 10/1000ths of an inch or less on a guitar of this style. That's a subjective figure. Some people want less, some people want to see more. It's really a complex formula involving the nut height, the expected action height, and what the neck actually does under tension. Some necks can be made straighter than others. This one could use a little straightening, so I'll adjust the truss rod. That's about as much as I'd ever adjust a truss rod at one go. Like an 1/8 of a turn, that's enough. So I'll adjust the truss rod to get it right where I want it, and then I'll recheck the action to see if it's changed, as well as making note of the new relief. So now I'm just under 10/1000ths relief, and the action has actually come down to about 4/64ths on both bass and treble. So we're getting there. Before I start working on the action, the player would actually like to swap out this bridge here. He's noticed that some of the saddles are rattling around in their tracks, and some of the string slots are pretty mangled at this point. They're quite wide and not really doing the job for him. So he's found himself a go-toe, which we'll put in there. Yeah, I know you purists. It's fine though. I mean, we'll save this in the case for future generations, all right? He wants a new bridge. This one has a fairly wide range of intonation possibilities, which is a good thing. Just looking at the saddles on the original one here, they are in some positions that I find unusual. Like, this does not look like your normal setup. So I know there's going to be some intonation work required. Anyway, put the new bridge on. The Godot bridge had the correct post spacing, but the holes in it were just a little loose for use with the original screw studs in the guitar, about 20/1000ths and half a millimeter larger than the originals. So I decided to cut some brass shim stock to make super thin bushings. I used the old geometry trick to find the circumference of a circle. It's pi times radius squared. See? Comes in handy, kids. And then I subtracted a couple of thousandths so they'd be sure to fit. Used an appropriate sized drill bit here to wrap them around and into the radius. With the top edge blackened, you don't even notice them when they're in place. Okay, that's on there good and securely. It still allows for adjustment. It's good practice to make sure that none of the tuner screws are loose, like this character here. And also snug up any loose tuner retaining nuts here. Just snug, not super tight. This happens usually during the winter as the wood of the headstock dries out. Lack of humidity, so it shrinks slightly. If you tighten them super tight, summertime will come along, it'll swell back up, and it can be enough pressure to cause cracking in the lacquer. So snug, but not too snug. Up next is checking the height of the nut slots. I've shown this before. The quick way of testing involves fretting the string at the 3rd fret and checking to see that there's a little bit of clearance over the 1st fret. It's a very small clearance. If you've got good eyes or good glasses, you sight along the fret with a light behind it and you'll see it's in the order of like maybe 2-3 thousandths, like thickness of a piece of paper. So if you do this enough, you gain a feel for it, and I can tell that this nut slot is a little bit higher than it needs to be. For a more scientific method, we take out the feeler gauges again, and this low E, without pressing it down on any of the frets, should be about 21 thousandths clearance. And like I thought, this one is just a bit high. So I'll do the bass strings at around 21 thousandths, the middle ones slightly lower, and the high strings in the realm of about 17 or 18 thousandths. And I don't measure them all, I do it by eye. I get, one and I can sort of figure out where the others land. If the slots are too low, the strings will buzz against the 1st fret when you play them open, so don't go too low. And if they are too low when the guitar arrives, well, then I'm either making or installing a new nut, or perhaps shimming this one. Those operations cost extra. They don't fall under the umbrella of the standard setup. So here's where some variations come in. I think most of us agree that a setup refers to taking an instrument and making it play as good as possible without changing the structural elements of the guitar. You work with what's there, what's been handed to you. You can cut the nut and saddle a little bit, or maybe the addition of a shim in a Fender style bolt-on neck for the action. Usually fret dressing or reshaping isn't included, but a cleanup of the fretboard and polishing the frets is. And I'd say that deburring or knocking the sharp corners off of a fret end falls into the setup category. And dialing in the action now. Not worried about the intonation yet. We're just dealing with string height. If you're going to lower the action, it's okay to do it with the strings at tension, but if you want to raise it with this style of bridge, you definitely want to decrease the string tension or use one of those commercially devised props that hold the bridge up while you adjust the little wheels. So on this guitar, we're shooting for an action of around 3/64ths, which is about 1.2 millimeters, which is on the low side. Now, occasionally I'll throw in a little bit of fret dressing and recrowning if there's a high fret or two, or maybe there's some notching and wear down on the first few frets. A lot of people won't do that. There are minimalists who only set the action height, the relief, the intonation, and the pickup height. Anything beyond that, and you pay extra. I think I do it because it falls into this thing that I was saying where most of my setups come packaged with bigger repairs, and it would feel really incomplete if I didn't get the guitar playing as well as I could, right? So this is definitely one of those situations that calls for some dressing. This is a condition that often happens in Gibsons with necks that attach higher up the fretboard with the double cutaways, SGs, 335s, that kind of thing. There's a lot of neck here, and the attachment length with the body, the tendon that actually goes in there, is pretty short. Over time, the neck can bow up a little bit relative to the plane of the top, and if you sight down the length of it, it kicks up at the end like a ski jump. It's usually a fret or two that will be high enough to choke out the strings, so I'll mark out the offenders and we'll dress and recrown those. So I've dropped the neck pickup down low so I won't run into it with my file when I'm doing the dressing, and my fret rocker at the ready to check things as I go. I'll start dressing these. I've given myself the basic outline of what needs to happen here. You could use a sanding beam. In this case, where I'm just doing a small portion of the fretboard, a nice flat file works fine for me. The other thing I should do is darken the entire fret so I can see where I'm taking material off. Something I'm doing is listening and sort of feeling what's going on with the fret. You can sometimes hear a sort of, there's a characteristic squeaky sound that happens sometimes when the fret isn't seated in its slot. It's loose in there. You get this kind of a squeaky sound. Or you can just sort of see it move sometimes when the file runs over it. These seem pretty solid. You can start to recognize the patterns. You can see that these frets down at the end have more material coming off them because they are kicked up higher. And as those come down into line, these frets back here start to catch up. People talk about the radius of the fingerboard and how do you preserve that. Well, I'm not really removing very much material here. It's in the order of maybe 3, 4, maybe 5 thousandths at the end of the fretboard. So you don't have to really worry about destroying the integrity of the fretboard radius. If anything, you'd probably flatten it out a little bit, which is kind of advantageous on those upper reaches of the fretboard anyway, because it acts almost like a compound radius and makes fret bending a little bit more clean. Okay, so I have removed material on all of those offending frets. Now, you can see there's one in the center that was actually lower than the others. It looks okay. I'm going to crown them because I'm pretty sure this is going to do the trick. So I'll darken these again. Of course, some of these Gibson boards have the binding which has the little nubs on the end, which you have to be careful with. You don't want to snap those off or make them misshapen or anything, so crowning can be a bit more of a chore. Most repair guys despise these little nubbins. A little bit on there. Okay. Working on these. This reminds me of something. Last weekend I did an AMA-style interview with Ian Davlin for his Patreon, to which I subscribe. You've heard me mention him before. He's the one who came up with the DC-driven resistance heater trick for... He used it for neck removal at first. That was the one I used to take the plug out of that Strat headstock. Anyway, he's got a really great Patreon, and he's been thinking about a trick. We've been exchanging ideas, actually, for a powered reciprocating fret file. You know, something that you could just hold in your hand and it does this action for you, like an electric carving knife with a file on it that goes back and forth. Because this does grow old, especially if you've done a bunch of stainless fret jobs, one after the other. Because, you know, say goodbye to your knuckles and your wrist. Anyway, the interview went on for more than an hour. It was really fun. We discussed, well, primarily, you know, what's it like being a superstar YouTube luthier. But other things as well. You could sign up to his Patreon and see that. It's only, I think it's only $3, which is a good deal. He's got good stuff on there. Or I think he might actually also put portions of the interviews up on his YouTube channel. His YouTube is worth visiting as well. I'll leave a link in the description there. It's Ian Hates Guitars, which is a good name. This is kind of ridiculous. It's great right out of the box. This new bridge here, the intonation lines up almost exactly, and even all the way down. Very little movement has to happen here. So when setting the intonation, basically I want to make the octave note at the 12th fret coincide perfectly with the fundamental note of the open string. So we shift the saddles backwards or forwards a little bit until they line up. People ask if it's important to have a Peterson strobe tuner to do this. And my answer is, I don't think so. Peterson's a good tuner. I've had experience with 2 of them. One was from the 60s. It was this great big monster of a thing. It got real hot. But I've tried a modern one as well. They're very expensive. They work well. They give me a headache if I look at them too long. And at the end of the day, I'm just happy with my little Korgs here. Because, well, here's the thing. Playing a guitar involves pressing the strings down on the frets, which stretches them and that sharpens the note, which varies from string to string and in different places on the board. So if you add in the inconsistencies of using equal temperament with fixed frets, which is a long discussion, you're always reaching for a compromise. The guitar can't play in tune everywhere. There are systems that you can use to get it close, in which case you're usually playing out of tune with the other guitarists in your band. In general, if you get the octaves ringing true, that's great for 99% of the population. Some folks like to focus on, tuning specific intervals between specific strings. They might want the thirds or the fifths to sound a particular way. That's fine too. If absolute pitch is your goal, you're probably better off using a programmable synth or something, because the guitar, it's an imperfect system played by imperfect people, and it's never going to be perfect everywhere. Okay, so the G string is a little bit sharp. That means that the saddle has to move away from the headstock a little bit. If the fretted note was flat, I'd have to move it in towards the headstock. Isn't it funny that the Japanese would use a Phillips head screw where the Americans still use a flat-headed one? So the nice thing about these Goto bridges is there isn't a spring capturing system to try and keep the saddles in place. There's just a little nut and a little bolt. I can stretch that note sharp too just by pressing harder on the string. So you have to be careful to try and equalize the pressure when you're noting. Light touch, very heavy touch. Okay, setting pickup height. Most people are happy with manufacturer's recommendations, which should be about 1/8 of an inch and 3/32 on the neck pickup, and about 3/32 and 1/16 of an inch on the bridge pickup. If you get it too low, it ends up being kind of indistinct sounding. If you get them too high, especially the neck pickup, you'll end up with a weird warbly kind of effect, which is very unpleasant. Okay, I think we can call this one done. The action ended up at less than 4/64 on the bass side, less than 3/64 on the treble, which is good and reasonably low for a rock and roll machine like this. And, well, it's 30% lower than what it came in with, so I think we did pretty well for ourselves there. And of course it now plays all the way to the top end of the board, which is, hey, that's a bonus. Yeah, I like 335s. Oh yeah, one final word of warning. If you find yourself working on a Gibson like this, and coincidentally also working on its exact Epiphone twin, you better make sure they get back in the right cases. Otherwise only one customer will be happy with you.